Just finally, I'll ask this question now on behalf of the 450,000 Australians who are unable to enjoy television with their friends and family due to the need for audio descriptive services. As I hope you are all aware, Australia continues to be the only English-speaking member of the OECD that does not have any audio descriptive services on television. So when will the government be moving to introduce audio descriptions on Australian television?
Senator, I think you may be aware that last year the Minister asked the Department to convene a working group on audio description to consider how we could possibly implement it in Australia.
Yes.
What would be the best way to get it to the widest possible audience in the quickest amount of time. We convened that working group, which met 4 or 5 times over the last 6 months of 2017. Through that process, we brought together people who were blind and vision impaired, providers of audio description services, free-to-air broadcasters, subscription broadcasters, and we also brought in overseas examples and guests from other jurisdictions to explain how it was being delivered.
Yes, I'm aware, okay. And the report was delivered, if I understand, on the 27th of December last year, and it came up with 3 different options in regards to the provision of AD. So I would really like to know when that report is going to be made public.
Well, that would be a matter for the Minister.
Can I put that to you, Minister?
We haven't made that determination yet.
What's the hang-up? Can I inquire as to the?
There's no hang-up. The report has been concluded, and it's now appropriate that we review the report and determine where.
You're not going to do a games inquiry on me, are you, and make me wait 600 days for no apparent reason?
Senator, I've answered your question.
You know, it's 450,000 people. I'd like to ask anybody in this room what they think their daily life would be like without being able to access television services, what kind of social impact that would have. I would also remind you once again that we're the only English-speaking nation of the OECD that doesn't do any of this stuff. Now, you have convened I'm sure, very extensively executed working group process. You have the report and have had it for 3 months now, and I've been through this process, particularly with your department before. Can you give me a clear timeline as to the date at which this report will be made public? It isn't hard.
Senator,
you've got a very big in tray. You know, does it get lost in there, or what the hell happens?
Senator, nothing is lost. We will release the government's response to the report when we're in a position to do so. I can't.
So if a constituent comes to me and asks me, as has happened a couple of times now, what the timeline around this is, the best answer you can tell me to give them is when the government feels ready.
I can't tell you when a decision will be made before a decision has been made, Senator.
All right. Well, that'll satisfy you. Thank you very much for your time, guys.
Thank you, Senator Stewart. Senator Urquhart.
Thank you, Chair. I might just go to the Minister first. And Senator Steele-John has just raised the issue of a report and the reporting date and the time frame for a government response. I've got some questions around the Game On More Than Playing Around report. The last year, in a letter dated the 6th of December 2017, you wrote to the President of the Senate stating that you'd be able to table the government response to that inquiry, and I quote, prior to the end of 2017. So I just wanted to know, Minister, did you set that deadline when you wrote to the Minister?
Well, it wasn't a deadline. It was what was anticipated. It was when it was anticipated.
Okay, so you set that anticipated date.
But that was what we were anticipating.
Yeah. Okay. So you didn't meet the deadline. We know that. Did you ever intend to meet that deadline, and why didn't you meet that? Why didn't you meet that anticipated date?
Senator, the report is the Senate report covered a number of portfolio areas.
I understand that.
And there are internal government clearance processes that go across portfolios and then receive central approval before a government response to a report can be furnished.
Okay, so then can I ask why it took 643 days for the government to respond to that report? It was tabled in April 2016, as you'd know, almost 2 years ago. Why did it take over 600 days to say that you're not going to do anything to further the 8 unanimous recommendations of the Game On report? And I stress that they were unanimous. There was representation from all parties and I think a crossbencher on that committee, and they were unanimous recommendations. So why so long to say you're not going to do anything to further those 8 recommendations?
Senator, first point is the report didn't say that the government isn't going to do anything. The report...
No, anything
the
to further
no,
those recommendations.
Well, it didn't say that either. That numbers of the recommendations were noted. The government's response to that report was never intended to be the final word in this area, and it is not usual for government responses to Senate inquiries. It happens sometimes, but it's not the ordinary course of events. The government responses to Senate inquiries is the vehicle through which policy is made and announced.
Right, but given they were unanimous recommendations from that report, I would have thought that getting more than a noted would have been appropriate in a number of areas.
Senator, I repeat, in the ordinary course of events, government policy is not made by way of or communicated through government responses to Senate inquiries.
Okay, I heard you the first time. So does the Turnbull government think that it's already doing enough to support the Australian video games development industry?
Look, government across a range of areas always keeps under review if there is more that can be done to better assist a range of industry sectors.
So I'm asking specifically about the Australian video games development industry.
Well,
I'm not talking about other sectors.
My response applies to that.
So a broad question about every industry.
Well,
that's all you're entitled. That's all you're prepared to give me.
This is an important industry sector, and as with all industry sectors, the government keeps policy under review.
Okay. So do you concede that the amount of time that the government took to respond to the report created uncertainty for the game development sector?
Well, as I indicated, more often than not, government responses to parliamentary reports are not the vehicle through which policy change is determined or articulated.
Okay, so let me go to the amount of time that it took to respond, which was, as I've said, over 600 days. Was there anything particularly complex that took so much time?
Senator, the government has provided its response to that committee
You know,
report.
I understand that, but just in terms of the time, can you just outline to me, was there anything that was particularly complex as to why it took so much time?
Senator, there were a number of portfolios so that's the
for
whom
complexity?
recommendations were relevant and consultations happened accordingly.
So are you saying that the number of portfolios and the discussions that took place, that's where the complexity lies?
Well, I'm just stating as a fact that it's the case that recommendations did cross a number of portfolios.
Okay, so was there any particular department or agency or other stakeholder that required a lot of time to consider the report, so more time than other?
Senator, I can't add to what I've said.
Who did the government consult with in formulating its response?
I'll ask Mr Eccles to add if he can.
So there were a number of portfolios. There was the Treasury, the Department of Industry
Sorry,
Innovation.
Mr Eccles, did the department formulate the response or did the government?
It's a distinction where the government, the department developed a response and it was provided to the government for consideration, so it should be considered as a government response.
Right.
It's the usual way of doing business.
Okay, so the response that the department provided to the government, is that the final response that we got in the report, or the response to the report?
There is only one response, and that is the response that we have, and that is the government response.
So that's what the department generated? I'm only asking because I'm not trying to be difficult.
No, it's
because my question was specifically who did the government consult with in formulating the response.
so the
So
government.
I'm trying to work out whether it was the department that formulated the response or the government.
I don't think you can distinguish between the two. So in developing our advice to the government,
Yep.
we obviously consulted and took into account the positions of various portfolios, including Austrade, Treasury, the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science,
Yep.
and as the lead department involved, we worked with those agencies.
So
and put
Austrade,
forward-
the Department of Innovation,
so it was Industry, Innovation and Science,
yes,
Austrade
yep,
and Treasury,
yep.
and there may have been others, but I think they were the main ones, Senator.
Okay, so that was the consultation that was taking place in formulating the response.
In developing our advice to the government.
Right, okay. So, Minister, the recommendations of the Senate report were unanimous, as I indicated earlier. How many recommendations of the Game On report does the government support?
I'll ask Mr Eccles. I don't have the report to hand.
I in turn might refer to Dr Arnott.
There were only 8, so...
Thanks, Senator Urquhart. Stephen Arnott, First Assistant Secretary, Arts. The government has indicated its response to the various recommendations, so I can't
understand
really
that.
add more to that. A number of recommendations have been noted.
Yep. How many did the government support, Mr Arnott?
That's not a question I can answer beyond what's in the government
There's
response.
There's 8 recommendations. They were all unanimous.
Okay.
How many did the government support? It's not a hard question.
Sure, let me just go through it. Okay, so the government supported in its response recommendation 4.
Yep. So 1. Yep. Okay. Minister, recommendation of the Game On report is that, and I'll quote, the committee recommends that the Australian government commit to rolling out 21st century broadband infrastructure. However, the government merely notes this recommendation rather than supports it. So that's not one of the ones that supports, it's one that was noted.
The government noted it because we're doing it.
So you're rolling out 21st century broadband infrastructure.
Correct.
So you noted that.
Because it's something that's
Did you
happening.
note it because the Turnbull government is fully committed to rolling out 19th century copper broadband network?
No, we noted it because it's something that's occurring.
That you're rolling out 19th century broadband copper?
No, that we're rolling out 21st century broadband.
Okay. To what extent does the report of the content review conducted by the department, Screen Australia and the ACMA look at setting to support the video gaming development industry?
Well, I know that there have been a range of submissions received by the content review on that subject.
So a number of submissions, that's it.
Well, that's right. The content review process is ongoing within government.
So what is it that the games development industry does not have the same funding? Why is it, that the games industry, development industry does not have the same funding and tax incentives that the Australian film and TV industry have been offered by the government for many years? What's the difference?
I guess the answer to that is in 2 parts. One is that there's an historical difference, and the other is that in an earlier budget there was a change to a funding pool, which I think was administered by Screen Australia, in terms of the gaming industry.
What specific programs under the National Innovation and Science Agenda do you believe game developers could realistically benefit from, and how?
That formed part of the government's response to the report.
And certainly the games industry is able to access the support that a number of other industries and enterprises are able to access through the portfolio that's the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science.
So, Mr Eccles, can you just take me through the specific programs under that agenda that you think
I
that...
can certainly take that on notice. That would be a matter for that relevant department,
Okay.
and it would be risky for me to go into too much
If you
detail.
could take that on notice, that would be fine.
Absolutely.
Are the R&D tax incentive export market development grant and the NISA programs actually sufficient alternatives to the initiatives recommended by the Senate, including the Australian Interactive Games funding and tax breaks?
Again, I'd like to consult with the relevant department and come back to you, Senator.
Okay, so you'll take that on notice?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So keeping in mind the length of time that it took to respond, as I said, over 600 days, can you confirm how long was spent examining the viability of these alternative programs for the games development industry? And will the government provide that information on alternatives to the public?
Can you ask the question again?
Yep.
There was
So-
several bits to it.
So keeping in mind the length of time, I've already outlined it took over 600 days to get the response to that report. Can you confirm how long was spent examining the viability of alternative programs for the games development industry? And that they're the alternative programs that I talked about in the previous two questions. And will the government provide the information on alternatives to the public?
So
Will
the
that
first
be made
bit,
public?
I cannot answer the question around the timeframes. But what I can tell you, Senator, is that
Can you take
as
that
a-
on notice, Mr Eccles?
I'm not sure if that's able to be determined, but
Right.
we'll see what we can do. But I can tell you that we are in very regular discussions with our colleagues in that other department that I've named about the interactions between the creative industries and the programs that they run. And it's fair to say that there are a number of programs that they have which have potential to support the creative industries.
Right,
But that
and-
goes to the earlier question. That
Yes, okay,
I
but
took
and
on
will that
notice.
information on what the alternatives are be provided to the public?
I imagine that they are made available to the public
Right.
through the various programs that department does, reaching out to SMEs and others, encouraging them
Yep.
to apply for support.
So
through
you
their
said you
various means.
imagine, are you able to confirm that on notice?
Absolutely.
Great, okay, thanks very much. I've got some questions around the gambling ad restrictions during live sports. And another one of the deadlines is coming up soon, Minister. Further restrictions on gambling advertising during live sport. So you announced these restrictions back in May 2017, yet we're still waiting, the public's waiting on them to commence. Why is it taking so long for the government to address community concerns around gambling promotions during live sport?
Well, at the time of the announcement, we said that the intention was that the new arrangements would take effect from the 13th?
End of March.
Sorry, from the end of
March,
March.
yes. So from May last year, why has it taken so long?
Because, firstly, it's appropriate to give some period of notice to the parties involved. Secondly, there's the requirement for codes to be amended, and ACMA have a legislated process that they need to go through to look at the amendment of codes. Also, for those
How many codes need to be amended, Minister?
I'll ask officers to speak to that, but just before they do, I'll just finish by saying, but there's also legislation required to give effect to those platforms which aren't covered by codes.
Senator, there are 3 codes that require amendment. So that's the
Three.
Commercial Radio Australia codes, the ASTRA codes covering subscription television,
Yeah.
and the free TV codes.
Okay. Are you aware of reports that there was more than the usual number of gambling promotions during the Australian Open this year?
I am not, Senator.
Okay. I'll give you an example. A new daily piece by Alana Mitchelson, dated 17th of January 2018, stated that Channel 7 should be actively restricting these kinds of gambling ads, and that this was the last hurrah for the industry before new restrictions come in. So you don't...
I'm not aware of that particular article, but,
Right.
But-
Channel 7 and others will be part of the new arrangement once it comes into being on the...
So do you think it was their new hurrah?
I've got no idea.
The last
Senator.
hurrah?
There are some existing restrictions on gambling advertising, but obviously what is in prospect will add to those and be more comprehensive.
So are you...
But obviously something can't take effect until it takes effect.
Yeah, no, I understand that. So are you aware that of the reports that there was more than the usual number of gambling promotions during the Australian Open?
No, Senator, I'm not.
You're not aware?
No.
So as the responsible minister, how confident are you in the ability of the broadcasters to draft appropriate codes of standard to restrict gambling advertising in accordance with community standards?
Well, we've outlined what our expectations are, and it's not a case that the relevant industry sectors simply draw up their own requirements. ACMA is required to be satisfied, and that there's mandatory consultation that is gone through as part of that process.
Okay. Do you-
Mr. Eccles, I think, is wanting to add something.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
And those codes have been provided in draft form to the ACMA, and they are currently under consideration.
And is there a time frame for that?
They will need to be in place by the end of March so
Yep.
that the provisions can take effect.
Yeah, okay. So do you think that the self-imposed deadline for March will be met for broadcast platforms?
I think they're very aware that the government's position on this would be that they should develop industry codes, or alternative mechanisms would be entertained.
And is that a deadline, or is it an anticipated date, the end of March?
In our mind, it is a deadline.
In your mind, it's a deadline?
Absolutely.
Right.
And we've made that abundantly clear to the broadcasters, and they have been working in good faith
Right.
to develop codes of practice, or codes of practice. And as I said, they have submitted them to the ACMA, and they're
Yeah.
currently under
Okay,
assessment.
so you're very confident that they will be ready to go by the end of March?
I haven't seen the codes as submitted,
Yeah.
but I'm confident that the broadcasters have acted in good faith
Yeah.
and put forward something, but ACMA are currently assessing
Yes,
them, so
okay.
that might be something for the ACMA rather than us.
So just on the broadcast codes of practice, your stated intent is that the new gambling ad restrictions will apply between 5am and 8:30pm to establish a clear safe zone during which parents can have confidence that their children will not be exposed to gambling advertisements. Is it the government's intention that any particular time zone apply to those restrictions? So, for example, is it Australian Eastern Daylight Saving Time, or what is it? And is it the government's intention that parents and children in WA experience the same clear safe zone as parents and children in New South Wales, for example?
I'm aware of the issue that you raised, Senator, and it goes to a technical issue around how signals are broadcast. For the free-to-air television, they use a terrestrial signal, which means that in any location, it can be in Perth, for example, they will show advertisements that are around, Perth
Yeah.
issues, for example. The subscription television broadcasts a single national signal. And so in developing the code, ASTRA, which is representing the subscription television, will put forward that the code will apply to the Eastern Standard Time. So
Right.
Eastern, given that's the bulk of the population.
Yeah.
They only have one signal, and so it was agreed.
So it may very well be possible that in Western Australia, in a different time zone, that will be viewed 2 hours earlier, or in fact 3 hours earlier during daylight saving time.
That's correct, Senator. The disruption to their business models would have been profound, and would have, brought into question their ability to actually broadcast sports.
Okay. So is it the government's intention that exemptions to the new restrictions be permitted under the broadcast codes of practice? For example, niche sports where a subscription channel group collectively has a very small audience share?
These are matters that ACMA will look at. ACMA is very aware of the government's intentions,
Yep.
and they're looking at all the different codes to assess the extent to which they give or are consistent with the government view.
Yep.
We are aware of issues around very small audience television programming, or broadcasts that are just beamed, almost a signal taken directly from overseas, or just a package lot. ACMA are getting their head around all those issues, and will
Yeah.
make an assessment on that basis.
So what will the government do if the ACMA registers codes of practice that run counter to the government's intent on matters relating to time zone differences or exemptions?
I think
How will that be dealt with?
that's a hypothetical, Senator.
Well, it is, but it could actually happen. And I'm just trying to find out how will the government deal with that?
I'm trying to. Can you ask the question again, just around the
So what will the
specific
government do if the
examples?
ACMA registers codes of practice that run counter to the government's intent on matters relating to time zone differences or exemptions?
I can't foresee a situation where the ACMA, who have been asked to administer a program of action, if you like, to give effect to a government policy, I can't imagine the situation where the ACMA counters that. I can't conceive of ACMA acting when the government has asked them to consider a program of activity. I can't imagine how they would work counter to that.
Yeah, okay. I'm not suggesting that
No.
they would intentionally do that, but it could be something that happens and is unintentional.
Look, we don't interfere with ACMA's issues, but we are in regular discussion with them.
Yep.
And there may be a discussion at that point.
Okay. So, Minister, you have a bill before the Parliament, the Communications Legislation Amendment, Online Content Services and Other Measures Bill 2017, that contains a provision to insert a new Section 125A into the Broadcasting Service Act of 1992. What's the purpose of the new section?
Of which particular section, Senator?
Section 125A?
Yeah, I don't.
You don't have that with
I
you?
don't have with me the full pile of legislation in the portfolio that's moving its way through the legislative processes, but I'm sure officers will endeavour to assist.
Just give us a moment and Dr. Patterson will be able to assist.
So the questions I'm after is what is the purpose of the new section and what reasons for introducing this new section?
So, Senator, I think this perhaps goes to the question you asked before. The purpose of Section 125A is means that the Minister has the power to direct the ACMA, if necessary, to determine a program standard. So it is only in the legislation, in case the code negotiations fail, to provide certainty to the change in the gambling ad restrictions.
Okay, and what's the reason for introducing that new section?
So it is just there, Senator, to ensure that the government's policy intent can be enacted.
Okay. So the ACMA is already empowered under Section 125 of the BSA to determine program standards. That's correct, is it not?
That is correct.
Yep. So the explanatory memorandum states that the new Section 125A is intended to deal with the situation where the broadcasting codes registered by the ACMA fail to provide adequate protection in a manner consistent with community standards, but the ACMA does not determine a standard under Section 125 or would not determine a standard on terms considered acceptable to the government. So do you doubt the capacity of the ACMA or the co-regulatory system of broadcast regulation to strike that right balance on gambling ad restrictions during live sports broadcast? Is that the purpose of the new section?
Certainly not, Senator, and as Mr Eccles has indicated, we have every indication that the codes will be, finalised and registered to meet the deadline. The entire purpose of this is to make sure that there is the option for the government to ensure that the policy intent is implemented.
Right, but the Ministry is already empowered under the ACMA Act to give directions to the ACMA in relation to the performance of its functions and the exercise of its powers. So do you understand this direction's power to be too general to deal with the situation you're contemplating that demands the introduction of a new section 125A?
So our understanding, Senator, is that the existing section 125, you're quite correct, could require the ACMA to determine a program standard addressing the gambling advertising, but only in limited circumstances. And there's no requirement that that standard might be made that would be consistent with government policy, whereas section 125A makes it quite explicit and is necessary to ensure that the relevant program standard can be made and that the resulting standard is consistent with the government's policy. So it's making it crystal clear that the standard will be consistent with the government's policy.
Okay, but Parliament is already empowered under section 128 of the PSA to amend standards or codes of practice which have been determined or registered in accordance with Part 9 of the BSA. So is that section 128 not enough? So you still need to introduce a new section 125A?
As I understand it, Senator, our advice was that inserting section 125A was the best way to ensure the policy intent was achieved.
Right, so do I glean out of that then that section 128 is just simply not enough?
I would have to take that on notice, Senator.
Okay. So do you agree that the purpose of section 125A is to limit the discretion of the ACMA when it comes to the regulation of gambling advertising in broadcasting?
I don't think it's to restrict the powers of the ACMA at all, Senator.
I think, Senator, and we will clarify this on notice, but I think that provision was partly put in place in the event that the broadcasters didn't put forward a code that the ACMA could work with and approve.
Yeah.
And that's been our discussion with the broadcasters, is that our preference is that they self-regulate through their code or work with developing a code that works with their industry model. But in the event that they don't come to the party, and I need to stress that they have come to the party, in the event that they don't come to the party, there is always recourse for the government to exercise and legislate in effect.
Yep, great. Thank you for that.
So I think the target's more the writers of the original code rather than the ACMA.
Okay, yep, that clarifies it. That's great. So your stated intent is that the new gambling ad restrictions will apply between, as I said before, 5 a.m. and 8:30 p.m. How does the government intend to deal with the issue of time with the online environment?
So that will be a matter for the ACMA to determine as they work through the service provider rules.
Right, okay. And how will the ACMA work out how to apply that concept of time, given that online content service providers may be in a number of different time zones? Many, in fact.
So that is something they will work with the industry, so they will consult with the industry to look at how to give best effect and what makes the most practical sense as they develop the service provider rules.
So will the time in the place the content is viewed applied, or the time in place the content is transmitted apply? Which one?
In terms of the online environment,
Yes.
the intention of the policy is generally speaking where it's viewed. There are
So it's the
complexities.
viewing,
There are complexities as it relates to national signals. There are complexities as it relates to the online environment, and ACMA are working through those matters as we speak.
Okay. So will the approach to time in the online environment accord with the approach to time in the broadcast environment?
Too early for us to speculate on the considerations of the ACMA on that.
So do you think that scheme's workable? It sounds very complex and very difficult to try and work through a number of different time zones.
Well, there's a significant amount of material that is seen in the online environment that is easily adaptable. For
Yep.
example, the broadcasting of the major football codes on online platforms.
Yeah.
The issue then comes down to the minority and the exceptions, and that's what the ACMA is working through.
Okay.
I think that for the vast majority, it's a relatively straightforward policy.
Okay. So the bill gives responsibility for the consideration of exemptions to the ACMA, permitting both specific and class exemptions with very little guidance on what might qualify for a class exemption. So can you tell me, why is the government permitting such potentially expansive exemptions to the gambling ad restrictions in the online environment?
I think this is a new frontier in some ways. And the government's decision to regulate advertising in the online environment is something that has not been entertained until now. And I think it is on that basis, but the ACMA will be well placed to go into the extent to which these will have to be utilised.
And I think if I could just add, Senator, obviously for class exemptions, they'll be legislative instruments, so they will also be subject to disallowance.
Right, okay. Why does the government seek to restrict the discretion of the ACMA in the broadcast environment via the new Section 125A, yet increase the discretion of the ACMA in the online environment? So it seems like it's 50 cents each way.
I think that might go to the point I raised earlier that, and I've undertaken to take it on notice, but the intention of 112A in large was around giving the government recourse should the codes that were provided to the ACMA be insufficient for them to be able to work with the broadcasters to give effect to the government intentions.
Okay. So when...
Are you going to take us out to the lunch break on this one?
I can do that. I've got two more in this section, and then I've got some in relation to for the department.
Because I know Senator Chisholm, I think you've also got questions.
Senator Chisholm's got some too, so I'll try and quickly move through. Okay. So when do you anticipate the bill will be listed in debate for the Parliament and commence?
I'm not sure. We should be able to find that out very quickly for you.
Okay, so you can take that
soon.
on notice?
Soon. Yeah.
Soon?
Soon. That's
But
not
you'll
probably the
take
most
that on
helpful
notice.
answer.
Minister,
but-
do you have any light on that?
Well, in time that it can take effect.
Right. So it'll have, if it's going to take effect the end of March,
End of March.
it'll have to be in the next week's sitting agenda. Okay. So will the ACMA receive additional funding to administer the legislation?
No, Senator, we consider this to be augmentation of their core duties.
Right. Okay. All right, that's all I have on that particular section. I've just got some questions around the priorities of the incoming secretary. Mr Murdoch, can you provide an outline of your priorities for the department and any strategic pieces of work that you have initiated since assuming the role of secretary?
Senator, as you know, I've come to this portfolio only recently. Most of the focus continues to be on the implementation of elements. Obviously, the National Broadcast Network, the NBN, is a very high priority for government and the portfolio, as is the work that's taking place in relation to the legislation. There's a whole range of legislation. But essentially, the work of the department, as I see it, is going to focus increasingly on two key areas. One is provision of what I would call connectivity, getting the platforms, particularly as we see the emergence of new technologies and where the new platforms take us. Maintaining a very strong focus on competition in the market, but also a probably stronger focus on getting the investment signals right for industry in terms of regulatory structures and also incentives for investment, particularly in rural and regional Australia. And finally, trying to getting the platforms right around the connectivity. Really, then a strong focus, I think, on content, because I think, as we're all aware, content is where a lot of the value add for Australia will be in the future. And how do we best marry the arts content in the portfolio with what we're trying to do through broadcasting legislation and the like to make sure there are avenues for Australian content onto the new platforms. They're the two streams that I'm trying to develop. As part of that, I've done some restructuring of parts of the department to particularly to bring our analytical capacity into a single strategy and research group. So our bureau and a new strategy group have been formed under a strategy and research leadership to try and give us a perspective on much longer term investment prioritisation, as well as a capability to do better analytical work around future trends and directions. That's been the main areas, as well as I've done some minor restructuring around bringing together our corporate and governance functions into a more cohesive stream. But essentially, from my priorities are really around those two areas I mentioned, trying to get the connections right through the technology incentives, but also around content development.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Sounds like you've been busy, Mr. Murdoch.
It's a terrific portfolio. It's a wonderful.
It's very
wonderful,
interesting.
Yeah, it is. It's a terrific portfolio. And,
so, Minister, at Senate estimates last October, when asked what you were doing to address that many broken concepts that persist in Australian communications law and regulation, you said you'd be happy to take that on notice, offering to provide a point-by-point response to the broken concepts report that was published by the ACMA a number of years ago and then subsequently updated. So a month later, your written answer was effectively to ask the department. So, Minister, in its written response, the department said that work on the roadmap is under development. So you talked about a roadmap. So do you think that it is rather late in the day for the government now in its 5th year of office to fail to produce a roadmap for the communications sector?
Senator, we have a lot of work in train in the portfolio. As you'd be aware, we have a reform of spectrum management which is underway. We had some changes for the ACMA which are underway. We have the rollout of the National Broadband Network. We have the Mobile Black Spot program. We have had some changes in terms of arts funding, restoring money to the Australia Council. We have work underway in terms of what might be in the place of the current universal service obligation. We have work taking place in terms of enhanced consumer framework for the new telecommunications world. There's a lot of work underway. Obviously, we had media reform which has passed through the Parliament. So those are elements of our roadmap. But I do appreciate that there are stakeholders who value having a strategy document in the form of a roadmap. So that is something that we're also working on.
So, Mr. Murdoch, has the Minister discussed the roadmap with you?
Well, we have in terms of future directions for the portfolio, yes. I think as the Minister's outlined, we're particularly starting to focus on the next generation with the NBN as it transitions from project delivery to an ongoing business. How do we best develop what are the rest of the structures around the industry structures?
Okay, so you've had a discussion around that.
We have in terms of forward planning for the portfolio.
Okay, so, Minister, just for the record, could you clarify, obviously, as I said before, you're in the 5th year of the government, so do you have a communications policy roadmap? Just a yes or no is fine. Our agenda, our roadmap is the totality of the elements, some of which I've outlined. I should also add to that. I'm going to go through some separate ones, so that's why I just said a yes or no. So you do have a communications policy roadmap?
We have a policy agenda, absolutely.
Roadmap?
We have a policy agenda, absolutely.
Is an agenda equal to a roadmap?
Well, an agenda is a type of roadmap.
Okay, a type of roadmap, right. Do you have a digital economy strategy roadmap?
Well, the digital economy strategy is being coordinated by the portfolio of jobs and innovation.
So has that
Well, questions on that should be directed in the jobs and innovation estimates.
A 5G strategy?
We've announced the 5G working group to bring together business and regulators and a range of government portfolios to ensure that any regulatory impediments to the rollout of 5G are addressed.
Yep.
As part of our 5G agenda roadmap plan, call it what you will, we obviously have the work that's being undertaken on powers and immunities to ensure that that is fit for purpose and that there can be fast rollout of the high density infrastructure that will be required for 5G. We obviously have our plan to ensure that there's appropriate spectrum at the right time, and we have our 5G working group.
Okay, I think I'm being wound up, but
Yes.
I've got some that I would like to continue with
Okay, well, look,
after
we
the break.
will
Yep.
suspend for a break, and so I have an indication from Senator Chisholm that he has 10 or 15 minutes of questions in this general/program 1.1. And how long do you think, Senator Urquhart? Just so we can guide
I
officials.
have probably got, in this particular section now, I've only got about 3 more questions on in relation to the Secretary and the Department. Then I've got probably a few in some other areas.
Okay, well, hopefully not too long. And then
But
we'll be
that's
able
all
to-
right, we'll just work through until the
Super.
time frame and then we'll put the rest on
Okay,
notice. So,
we'll
yeah.
return at 1:20.
Okay, thanks. the Mobile Black Spot program. So, someone's on their way to the table? Great. Yep, sure. Thank you. Afternoon. I'm good. How are you?
Not too bad. Thank
Good. Good. Mr. Patterson, so can you tell me how many of the 499 round one mobile stations, mobile base stations, are now operational?
you. Okay. Lachlan Patterson, Assistant Secretary, Regional Deployment Branch. I'm just seeing if I've got the numbers broken down by round for you, Senator. Because I know we've got
99?
across both programs, both
Yep.
rounds, I know we've had 431 constructed and 407 operational.
Right.
Just checking for a round breakdown. I'm sure I've got a round breakdown. Okay, so on round one, we have 325 base stations on air. at the moment.
325?
325 out of
Yep.
the 499.
Okay, and are the rest on track to be completed by 30 June 2018?
So under the contracts, they're scheduled to be delivered by 30 June
Yes.
2018.
Yep.
In rolling out a program of this nature, there's always probably around 10% of base stations which we actively work with the carriers on. So are we going to get to the full 499 in 4 or 5 months' time? I can't give an ironclad guarantee on that, Senator.
Right. How are they tracking, Mr. Patterson? Is it
At the
from your
moment,
observation that it looks like that number will be very close
the
to?
way it's tracking at the moment, I
Yep.
mean, there'll be 90% plus construct definitely by the middle of the year.
Yep. Okay.
Which I think is pretty good. Do we get to that extra few percentage?
Yep.
I'm very reticent about making
Yep.
firm commitments. At the
Okay, great. So how many of the round two mobile base stations are now operational?
moment. 78,
78?
yes, out of the
And can you
266.
Sorry?
78 out of 266.
Yeah.
Yep.
And can you tell me when they will be completed?
So the round two base stations are scheduled to be, some of them are scheduled to be completed by 30th of June, but the
This
rest
year?
of them this year, the rest are scheduled to be completed by the end of October
Right.
this year.
Okay.
A base station in general takes 12 to 18 months from the decision you're going to build it to actually building it.
Yep.
Most of that time is related to planning approvals, lease arrangements for the land,
Yep.
ordering the equipment, clearing the site,
Yep.
a whole lot of environmental studies and so forth. So I'd expect to see those round two numbers go up substantially over the next few months.
Right, okay. And are they on track to be completed by October?
Similar comments to the
Yeah.
round
So
one.
about that 90%
Oh,
roughly?
yes, yes. 90% plus.
90 plus, sorry, I left the
Yeah.
plus off, yeah. And can you give me an update on the tender process for round three of the Mobile Black Spot program?
I can, Senator, noting that we're still going through the assessment process, so that does constrain me a little bit about what I can say.
Yeah.
The guidelines, the applications under the priority round guidelines came in just before Christmas, towards the end of December. We're going through the assessment process on those applications right now.
Yeah.
We're very, very close to finalising that. We've also been conducting contract negotiations where we have basically agreed terms